Hey everybody, in this video I want to talk briefly about acid-base balance and fluid balance overall in the body. The thing that we've been talking about over the course of the semester, particularly when we've been doing the circulatory system, is we talk about different kind of body compartments. Remember, we talked in class a little bit about the different names that the water has as it moves from place to place in the body. The majority of the fluid that's going to be found in your body is going to be your intracellular fluid. It accounts for about 2/3 of the overall body fluid. And then the extracellular compartment is the stuff that includes plasma, and then the all the other stuff that moves in tubes, like the lymph and interstitial fluid. But like in that interstitial fluid, you can also consider like cerebrospinal fluid, the humors within the eye, synovial fluid, gastrointestinal secretions, all that kind of stuff. So the idea is to try to keep the balance not exactly like this all the time, but have mechanisms to be able to return it back to these sort of normal proportions. Now, your water balance is, it's about 2,500 milliliters that our body puts in and out every day in order to maintain typical healthy metabolism. The majority of what comes in is, of course, going to be the stuff that you drink, the liquids that you drink, but there's a certain amount that comes in with the foods. And also this 10% of metabolism, that's describing the water that is produced as a result of basically the electron transport chains. If you remember, the citric acid cycle ends up producing not just carbon dioxide as a waste product, but also some water. So that 250 milliliters of water is stuff that's actually generated from cells making ATP. The way that we typically think of how we dehydrate is through urine or through sweat, but there's a fair amount, if you've ever, of course, you've all fogged a mirror with your breath before, we get those insensible losses that happen every day as well. Now, there are lots of electrolytes in the plasma. Electrolytes are ions that carry a charge, as opposed to proteins or glucose or urea, creatinine, that kind of stuff. But the body has to be able to regulate its blood pressure and at the same time regulate its solute concentration. So there are a few, by far the most important of these of these electrolytes in terms of number, in terms of concentration, in terms of where it's found in the body, is primarily about sodium. We've been talking about sodium since AMP1 because of the importance that it has for membrane potentials. But we've been also talking with the urinary system. We have to remember like the golden rule that water follows salt, water follows sodium. So there are different mechanisms that the brain has to be able to recognize where, when there's too much of any kind of concentrated sodium in the body. Interestingly, the body doesn't do it directly. The nervous system doesn't sense sodium directly through chemoreceptors specific for sodium. Rather, what it uses, at least in the hypothalamus, it uses these receptors that are called osmoreceptors that are sensitive to like concentration of fluids. And of course, because sodium is the most important one, it's going to be largely that's responsible for the for the kinds of responses that the brain's going to do. You can pause this for a second if you want to look at these sort of behavioral attributes that we do primarily through drinking. I mean, that would by far be the easiest way for the body to be able to reclaim water. But on the other hand, if you are, if you're in a place where either you don't have access to water, there are other compensatory mechanisms that the kidneys and other systems have in order to retrieve the water back from the filtrate before it gets excreted. And this is the stuff we've been talking about, it seems like forever. So it's going to be both antidiuretic hormone, which emplaces those aquaporins on the proximal convoluted tubule, also the action of aldosterone, the renin-angiotensin system, all those guys kind of working together in order to regulate sodium and by extension maintain normal blood pressure. Of course, it's possible to have too much sodium as well, and this is something we also talked about when we did the endocrine system, back with atrial natriuretic peptide, which basically works as an antagonist to ADH, to renin, and angiotensin. On the other hand, I think that, like I said, this is kind of a summary picture that sort of combines the other pictures I showed before, but all of these systems work together, not just to regulate sodium, but in the bigger service of maintaining normal blood pressure. Okay, so that's like the wrap on sodium. A lot of it's kind of repeat from before, so as you read the chapter, at least kind of breeze over the chapter for the objectives that are going to be specific to that. But the other main thing I wanted to talk about, a lot of you can find that's going to be a review. The other thing I want to talk about here is just a tiny bit about acid-base balance. Now, the body, God, I'm as bad as you guys. I need to stop saying that. We have spread among different organ systems, different ways to be able to regulate the acidity of the blood. The first of these ways is through chemical buffer systems. Now, we know that strong acids dissociate completely in water, and their effect can dramatically change pH. Weak acids, say like carbonic acid shown here, they will dissociate partly in water, but they're pretty good at preventing pH changes. So a chemical buffer is a system of one or more compounds that acts to resist pH changes when a strong acid or base is added. Because what happens is, if you have a mixture, say, of carbonic acid and salts of bicarbonate, it's going to have the effect of binding up the additional hydrogen ions that would, say, come from hydrochloric acid. I'm only showing this kind of bicarbonate buffer system here, but there's another one that involves phosphate as well. But it's a similar situation where it's when you combine a strong acid with a relatively weak base, then you're going to end up producing a weak acid and a salt. On the other hand, when you combine up a strong base with a weak acid, you end up getting a weaker base and water. The end result of both of these, if you haven't had general chemistry yet, is that these chemical buffer systems have the effect of minimizing the changes in pH that happens as our blood chemistry changes, say through exercise. Now, there are other ways to be able to, that's like the first line of defense, these buffer systems. In addition to these buffer systems, there are also responses that happen centrally due to central chemoreceptors. You remember the central chemoreceptors that are located in the medulla for sensing blood pH, and that's going to regulate ventilatory rate. So that ventilation rate, we know, like when we ran up and down the stairs, the ventilation rate is going to go up when you are trying to eliminate volatile acids. So for example, you remember how carbonic acid can get converted back into CO2? That's going to be volatile. So having that CO2 get released through the lungs is a quick way to be able to dump out the acid that accumulates in the blood. Now, this works well if we're talking about carbon dioxide gas, but the problem is there are some things that are not volatile, like lactic acid, for example. So in the case of lactic acid, there are renal mechanisms that will come into play. Now, the text gets into more detail about the different mechanisms to be able to balance out the acidity of the blood, but more than I think we can get into in this class. What I want you to understand, like the take-home message here is, rather than just being able to blow them off through the breath, substances that are acids that can't get exhaled are going to be combined with either hydrogen ions or combined with anions in order to get them so they can get excreted out through the urine. Okay, so that's like the main take-home message. And this is yet another set of the processes that happens to the filtrate when it's in the the proximal and distal convoluted tubules, especially the PCT. Anyway, that's all I really wanted to get to. I will talk with you about this soon.